In Constantinople in the 4th century, a newly widowed noble woman of enormous wealth found herself at a monumental crossroads. Either she could marry a wealthy suitor, arranged for her by the emperor himself, or dedicate her life to consecrated virginity, prayer, and almsgiving. A conventional life of comfort, or a prophetic life of hardship and adversity. For Olympia, the decision was easy. She would flee her life of wealth and luxury and devote herself wholeheartedly to her heavenly bridegroom, Jesus Christ, spending the rest of her days distributing her wealth with great liberality to the poor of the imperial city. Additionally, she would become the greatest friend, confidant, and spiritual child to the golden-mouthed, or Chrysostomos, orator of Constantinople, the Archbishop John. Little is known of the details of Olympia's life, yet her journey, however hidden, is bejeweled with the virtues of self-effacing love and patient endurance. Born in 362 into a pagan family of the upper aristocracy of Constantinople, Olympia's parents died when she was young, leaving her to the care of her uncle Ablabius and a governess, Theodosia, both pious Christians who raised her in the love of Christ. She inherited an enormous fortune from her paternal grandfather, who was a senator during the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great. Likewise, she received a great spiritual inheritance from her uncle and governess, surrounded as they were by fellowship with pillars of the Church, such as Saints Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory the Theologian. Saint Gregory the Theologian, for example, took great interest in Olympia after he arrived in Constantinople in 379 when, at the age of 17, she became one of the great benefactors of the Church of the Anastasis, where Gregory preached his renowned orations against the Arians. Olympia sought the counsel of Saint Gregory of Nyssa concerning the Song of Songs, thus prompting him to write his acclaimed commentary. In its prologue he greets the most worthy Olympias. By humbly deferring to her great spiritual stature, I do not offer you anything that would benefit your conduct, for I am persuaded that your soul's eye is pure from every passionate, unclean thought, and that it looks without hindrance at God's grace by means of those divine words of the song. However, I hope that my commentary will be a guide for the more fleshly minded, since the wisdom hidden in the Song of Songs leads to a spiritual state of the soul. At the age of 21, she married a man of high rank named Nebridius, but their relationship ended suddenly when he died soon after, leaving Olympia as a young widow, alone in the world bearing the burden of an enormous family fortune. Olympia decided to devote herself to virginity for Christ. Emperor Theodosius desired to marry her to one of his relatives, but Olympia adamantly refused, expressing her wishes to devote herself to consecrated celibacy. As a result, he threatened to take away her inheritance until the time that she would either agree to marry his suitor or turn 30 years old. He changed his mind, however, after hearing her bold and unexpected response.
You have demonstrated toward my lowly person a kindness most becoming an emperor, and commendable in a bishop when you entrusted this great burden, which has been my worry, to proper administration. You will do much better should you order it to be distributed to the poor in the churches. I have been praying for quite a while that I be set free from the embarrassment of vainglory, which would be mine if I distributed it to charity. Let me not be so seduced by earthly things as to lose the soul's true riches.
From then on, her life was dedicated to caring for the poor, serving the church as an ordained deaconess, and growing in her relationship as spiritual child and confidant to the great John Chrysostom. Years before the gold-mouthed theologian would come to Constantinople, however, Olympia established a monastery in a palace on one of her many properties. There she directed 250 female monastics as their abbess, modeling a life of extreme asceticism and fervent prayer to God. After she turned 30 years old, she was ordained to the diaconate by Archbishop Nectarios, St. John Chrysostom's predecessor, due to her many virtues, and in spite of the imperial and scriptural prohibitions against consecrated widows under the age of 60. While the full extent of her duties as a diaconess is not clear, it is known that she was tasked with tending to the needs of women as well as for those who were bedridden or sick. Her anonymous biographer, writing only decades after her repose, beautifully captures the entirety of her Christian devotion in the following way. She lived faultlessly in unmeasured tears night and day, submitting to every ordinance of man for the sake of the Lord, full of every reverence, bowing before the saints, venerating the bishops, honoring the presbyters, respecting the priests, welcoming the ascetics, being anxious for the virgins, supplying the widows, raising the orphans, shielding the elderly, looking after the weak, having compassion on sinners, guiding the lost, having pity on all, attending with all her heart to the poor, catechizing many unbelieving women, and making provision for all their material necessities in life. Thus, she left a reputation for goodness throughout her whole life, which is ever to be remembered. Having called from slavery to freedom her myriad household servants, she proclaimed them to be of equal honor as her own nobility. And so, after the blessed John Chrysostom took up residence in Constantinople in the year 398, it is no surprise that Olympia found a spiritual friend, mentor, guide, and confidant in the great ascetic, preacher, and pastor from Antioch, who was 13 years her senior. Among the many admirable qualities that Olympia exhibited, St. John was most impressed by the strength of her resolve to never remarry, which reminded him of his very own mother, Anthusa, who chose the same path after losing her husband. Olympia tended to the physical needs of her beloved spiritual father during his time in Constantinople, and became his constant servant and spiritual companion. But jealousy and human rivalries would soon disrupt the sweet wine of friendship that was shared between them. John was uncanonically deposed at the Synod of the Oak, which had been called and orchestrated by two of his bitterest antagonists, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria and Empress Eudoxia. The saintly pastor and teacher was sent into exile following the meeting of bishops, but was recalled only after a few days due to the empress's fear of having punished such a powerful spiritual leader. He faced grueling persecutions and pressure from his opponents, and many of the clergymen in the great city who resented his personal austerity and fiery preaching to reject the pleasures of this world and flee to Christ for comfort and meaning. The matter came to a head when the Empress Eudoxia ordered a silver statue of herself to be erected directly across from the great church of Hagia Sophia. Shortly thereafter, on a feast day of St. John the Baptist, Archbishop John proclaimed fearlessly, "Again Herodias dances, again she calls for the head of John," pointing poetically toward the ostentatious act of the Empress. This opposition paved the way for the Empress's final expression of hatred toward the unpretentious preacher, his next and final exile in June 404 AD. Many of the so-called Johnites fiercely protested this injustice, among whom was the devout deaconess and follower of St. John, Olympia. Twice put on trial, Olympia exonerated herself by proclaiming,
"My past life ought to avert all suspicion of me, for I have devoted my large inheritance to the restoration of the temples of God."
Despite her inner fortitude and desire to follow Christ, Olympia was tempted by despair and despondency, which became the subject of many of the letters that her beloved spiritual father wrote her from exile. In light of the persecution of St. John Chrysostom's supporters, Olympia fled Constantinople in 405 and settled in Nicomedia, dedicating herself to charitable works, leaving her sisterhood to the care of her spiritual daughter, Marina. 2 years later, the Golden Mouth died on a forced march towards more remote exile in Asia Minor on September 14th, 407. as if to bind herself to her beloved spiritual mentor and confidant in an act of solidarity. Olympia died only a year later, in Nicomedia, on July 24th. A great patristic scholar remarked that of the numerous correspondences that St. John carried out while in exile, the longest and most cordial are the 17 communications which he wrote to the widow and Deaconess Olympias. Born for adversity and living in fellowship with saints, Olympia is truly an icon of patient endurance, faithfulness, and loving loyalty. Saint Olympia, servant of the Church and friend of holiness, please pray to God for us.
Most Holy Saint Olympia, Counselor to Patriarchs, Deaconess and friend of Saint John Chrysostom, you are like a tower, a haven, and a wall of defense, as you speak to all in the eloquent voice of your example. You are rich in the fruits of courage, patience, and serenity, with the force of virtue as your rudder. You are a patron of the poor and a defender of the faith. Through the power of your philosophic soul, intercede with Christ our God to save our soul.